Righto, I'd like to talk about this statement that's been put out by a Hornsby councillor who's Green, and it's a very interesting statement. Let's just ignore the first section. It's just having a go at anyone that's not a Green, essentially. This is what 1 degree of warming looks like. Oh, okie dokie. So let's look at some facts. In Hornsby, live in a place where half the houses are on bushfire-prone land. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But let's have a look at what some of this land looked like back in 1942. And what we're looking at here is a fairly typical section of the North Shore. So what happened when with white settlement is all the flat bits on the top of the ridge lines looks like they got carved up for farms, and these bits here are fairly steep, rugged valleys, and you can see there's lots of areas of Sydney are cut by these things. It's usually a creek running through them, and they're really nice to walk through, but terrible places to try and build housing, although I have in fact seen some really quite spectacular houses built on stumps and stilts in areas like this. But I digress. Let's zoom in here, and if we go back to 1942, you can see that this land, which is now all quite dense housing, well, what does that look like? That's an orchard, that's an orchard, that's an orchard. Obviously all this stuff, well, there's an orchard there as well. All of this stuff is farmland. And when people talk about, the fires are much more catastrophic than they used to be, well, yeah, the thing you'd have to keep in mind is if a fire went through here in 1942 and all of this was burning and all of this was burning, what's it actually going to destroy in this area in the middle here? It might burn an orchard, you might lose the odd shed, you might lose a house, etc. But this is not densely packed multi-million-dollar housing, is it? It's open land in a lot of areas. Let's have a look at what one of these places looks like today. Now, this is not in the Hornsby Shire, but it's I just found it just because I happened to be looking at it. Those bits and pieces I was looking at were more, I think, over here, or here. Anyway, you can see there's lots of them, and this is just another one where you've got, well, look, Lovers Jump Creek running through the middle of it. And let's zoom down in here and have a look, and you can see, oh look, the bush comes right up to the back of these houses. How close to the back of these houses? Well, it's actually overhanging some of the houses. And let's just have a quick flick through this beautiful house, which probably sold for a couple of $1 million. And look, there's this bloody ginormous tree in the backyard, and that there is bush. I mean, it's monstrous. And I've been up this way, and it's lovely. It's a great place to live. Your backyard. Well, look, there's a eucalypt forest right behind you, and you'd have to wonder, what's the fuel load out the back there. Again, you can just see how close the bush comes in. If this goes up, then all of this is going to go up, and then what are these houses made of in general? Timber. All of this, it's just going to burn, and nothing's going to stop it. Oh, you look out through your lounge room window, and what do you got? Bush. Look out your bedroom window, what do you got? Bush. You can see what from 1942 to now. There's been this massive change in the settlement of these areas. They've changed from farmland into residential areas where the houses are butting right up against the bush. So this statement here, we live in a place where half the houses are on bushfire prone land. Yeah, absolutely, it is. And the question is, well, what would a sensible person do about that? And what I would do is, I would be clearing all the bush out from behind these houses, to, I don't know, at least a 10 or 20 metre buffer zone. So you've essentially got a fire break around the back of all these developments. Now, this is a really great little thing that Hornsby Council have got set up, and all this green stuff, you really need to take note of this. The green is ecologically sensitive, no, significant biodiversity. I guess is what you would normally call ecologically sensitive land. And look at that. It's probably saying that, I don't know, 40% maybe of the open space around Hornsby is classified as ecologically significant. Now, what that means is you can't mess around with anything in that area. It's like it's too touchy. But if we look at the areas that are fire prone, well, let's turn off the ecologically significant stuff. Okay, we can now see the boundaries of the Hornsby Shire, and let's have a look at the category 1 bushfire prone areas. Yeah, so significant biodiversity and bushfire prone overlap really nicely, and as we can see, all around these areas like Hornsby Heights, etc., they're just absolutely surrounded by bushfire prone stuff. And are there any buffers anywhere around these houses? Will this damn thing turn off or not? It's a great tool. Recommend having a look at it. I wish every council had something like this. Okay, there's a few tracks through there. There's, well, that's not really a. Is that really much of a what do you call it, fire break around there? No, I think not. And if we come in here and have a look at these places, I mean, look, you can actually see the lots, and you can barely see the house here for the trees. I mean, seriously, fire comes up here, it's just, these things are toast. But anyway, so that's worth having a look at. The RFS carries out regular hazard reduction burns. Yep, you get notification of the burns. Yep, all the councillors get them. I support them. Blah blah blah. The list of publicly available burns is here. Right, let's go and have a look at that. Okay, here we go. Hornsby website, hazard reduction burns. View the full list of planned burns. Site can't be reached. Okay, that's really good. Now, the other stuff that we get in here, so that really doesn't hold true, I guess. Or maybe it does, maybe they get emailed. The Greens support hazard reduction burns. They support more resources for local council who carry out burns. Yep, and we can read the policy there, which we will have a look at. Now, this next one down here, New South Wales government cut funding to the RFS in the budget. Well, I've actually gone through the fire service annual reports for the last 3 years, and I've actually had a look through things like the numbers, with employee expenses, etc. And yeah, deciphering the budget is really flippin' difficult. But so far, I actually can't see any evidence to support that statement. Yeah, I mean, it's been published in Crikey, but I look at things like the financial statements in in the annual reports. All this stuff is in here in great detail. This is what I look at if I want to see what's actually going on. Right, let's actually have a quick flick through the Greens bushfire risk management strategies. And what we can actually look here, what we can see here is all the stuff they're talking about here, includes the stuff about ecologically sustainable management. Now, you got to remember that when you think of that Hornsby map with all the green areas, because you want to go and burn off in there. Yeah, you want to do fire prevention or mitigation, i.e. create a fire break. It needs to, you can't do that in a ecologically sensitive area because it's got to be done in an ecologically sustainable manner. So hazard reduction, I mean, this is a classic, including manual, mechanical, blah blah blah, should be strategically planned and vulnerable to protect the community and vulnerable assets while minimising the adverse impacts of these activities on the environment. Okay, so we want you to go and burn off, but you've got to minimise the impact. I mean, it's like, it's Indian giving, essentially. That's how I would describe this policy. Yeah, you can do this, but you can't do it. Bushfire management should be informed by the knowledge of Indigenous Australians. I'd say most Greens have absolutely no idea of how Aboriginals actually do, fire, burning off these days. If they went up to the Northern Territory, I'm sure they'd be horrified, and they would brand just about everyone in the Northern Territory as being an insane arsonist. Strict controls are required to reduce the amount of rural burning that is not required for essential asset protection. What are essential assets? How do you define an essential asset? Is it a house? Is it a mobile phone tower? Is it a dam? Is it a fence? I mean, it's just not defined, is it? But essentially, they're saying you've got to restrict rural burning without really saying what that's about. Right, this is a clanger. Prescribed burning is only one method of fuel management and should be considered in the context of other available options and the management objectives of the land in question. Righto. So, you're out in the bush, there's a ton of wood on the ground, and there's a ton of leaves, and there's tons of grass. You can't burn it. So, how are you going to reduce the fuel load? Just think about that for a minute. You're looking at this plethora of sticks and stumps and logs and dead trees and leaves and grass that's maybe a couple of feet thick, and your job is to reduce that fuel load. And remember, you've got perhaps tens or hundreds of thousands of hectares of this. Right, we're going to do it manually, are we? Well, I mean, one way of doing that, reduction in fuel management, is harvesting some of the trees. No, Greens ban that. Another method, collection of firewood. No, that's been banned in national parks. Another method, reducing grass through grazing of sheep and cattle. No, that's banned. So how do you actually carry out this policy when there's all these other policies banning every known method of fuel management? I don't get it. Many vegetation communities and plants cannot survive frequent fire. Okay. Fine, I guess in the context of Hornsby, you'd want to actually identify those areas and identify those vegetation communities and plants and single them out. I guess that's in their strategies. They know not to burn those too often. Problem is, of course, that the severe fire comes through and just destroys absolutely everything and bakes it, doesn't it? Vegetation communities can undergo severe decline in biodiversity with long-term fire exclusion. Ecologically appropriate fire regimes are required to maintain biodiversity and functioning ecosystems. So one thing was saying it can't survive frequent fire, and on the other one they actually need fire. So how frequent is frequent? It's frequent every 6 months, every year, every 5 years, every 10 years. And what is long-term fire exclusion? Is it 10 years, 20 years? I don't know, you tell me. Firefighting services need additional resources. In particular, this is always local government begging, needed to be provided with more money, essentially, with regard to the assessment and implementation of hazard reduction strategies. Yep, begging bowl out. Local government can't fund anything, it seems, themselves. Education, of absolutely everyone, should be publicly funded. And it should address environmental issues. Essentially saying bushfires are caused by climate change, and you're all going to die. I guess is that the message we're promoting? Education and community awareness material needs to focus especially on the threat to the environment and to property of inappropriate use of fire, particularly burning that's too frequent, extensive in area, of excessive intensity, badly timed or carelessly implemented. Now, I absolutely support this stuff because you don't want to be burning off in summer. Obviously, that's bloody stupid. What's excessive intensity? If your fuel load's high and you've got to reduce it, well, you go back to this thing up here about how do you reduce the fuel load? Well, you might end up with a fairly intense fire, because the fuel load's just that flippin' high. What's too extensive an area? What are you talking about there? More than a couple of acres or whatever. What is too frequent? Who knows? Then there's all this stuff about, firefighters should be told about the legal implications for ecologically sustainable fire management and receive training on the environmental impact of bushfires. oh, flipping heck, do you think the fireys that are out there at the moment really give a bugger about the environmental effects of the bushfire? I mean, they might care about it afterwards, but, at the time, you're just interested in, containing the damn thing or putting it out or saving property or saving lives. I mean, obviously these people have never actually confronted a fire in their lives. Basic support courses for everyone should include specific information on the environmental impacts of frequent burning, appropriate fire regimes for biodiversity protection. I mean, that probably comes back to that green area in Hornsby, that you can't go into this different vegetation community because it's significant. Guidelines regarding the timing of burns, the manner in which burns are lit. What's that mean? Does it mean you can't run around with a dripping petrol torch and you can't throw matches out? Why do they care about how burns are lit? How they maintain and contained? Well, yeah, that's important. You don't want a fire to get away. Appropriate fire exclusion areas and buffer zones. Well, what? Yeah, how? I guess the really key thing is how big are these fire exclusion areas? I mean, if that whole green area in Hornsby is a fire exclusion area because it's ecologically significant, you've got a problem, haven't you? Buffer zones. Well, there are no buffer zones around those houses, are there? Anyway, yeah, they want to go and stuff your letterbox with risk management plans, etc. Right, high bushfire hazard areas are usually those associated with natural areas and vegetation. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw that from the overhead maps and all that kind of stuff. This is where it gets really funny. The location of residential or rural residential areas in high bushfire hazard areas increases the level of native vegetation loss as well as the level of threat to people and their homes. Yeah, okay, so if you buy a bush block, say in Margaret River, or in the hinterland outside any country town, or in the Blue Mountains, for instance, and you want to put a house on it, then obviously you're going to create some native vegetation loss because you're going to cut down some trees. You're obviously in a high bushfire hazard area, and that creates a threat to your house. I mean, look at the whole of Hornsby Shire. Essentially, the whole shire is in a high bushfire hazard area. This is neither economically, socially, nor ecologically sustainable, right? So you're not allowed to do it, obviously. New development that requires the clearing of native vegetarian on adjoining properties should not be permitted in identified bushfire-prone areas. Well, that's probably about 90% of the country, where such development is likely to put lives or property in danger or involve substantial protection and suppression costs, including loss of environmental values. I mean, yeah, essentially that just says all those areas, well, the way I read it, no more building nice little bush homes in the Blue Mountains. No more building nice little bush homes around Margaret River. Pick any nice country town along the coast where you want to push up into the hinterland away from the coast a bit. You know what this is? This is saying tree changing needs to stop. Okay. Right, the Greens will work towards the need for fire permits to be obtained at all times of the year in New South Wales when there is a significant risk of fire escape, not just during the bushfire danger period. I guess they'll probably, if this was implemented, then they'd simply say, every fire contains a significant risk of fire escape, so every single fire needs a fire permit, and then you just bog everyone down in red tape. They want to pay volunteers. Not sure the volunteers want to be paid. That's why they're volunteers. Next one, the Army's been called out for that. The carrying out of adequate environmental assessment on all activities or works proposed to be undertaken in accordance with a bushfire risk management plan. Everything here is about bogging down bushfire or fire management in red tape and bureaucracy. Accurate mapping of all proposed natural fires on a standardised GIS. Collecting data. Look, I can understand collecting data on fires that have actually happened, but why do you want to burden the RFS when they want to go and do a burn with this requirement to go into a GIS and stick everything in? Well, maybe the RFS will think that's useful and will require it, but maybe common sense could work as well, like it has for 100 years. Yeah, the use of plans of operations to determine both environmental impact and alternative fire suppression strategies, i.e. firefighting aircraft, for bushfire operations in natural areas and in particular wilderness areas in a national park or state. Yeah, well, having just read that, thanks to Bob Carr, all the fire trails, etc., in the national parks got blocked off about 20 years ago. So there's no longer any fire trails, so the RFS actually can't get in to fight spot fires, etc., in the national parks like they used to, because there's now bloody great logs or rocks across all the roads. You really are reduced to water bombing, aren't you? Or just letting the whole damn thing go. I'd be inclined to just let it go and, just suppress around the edges, but, who's going to listen to me? Bloody blah. Encourage provisions to protect native bushlands by prohibiting urban development that requires clearing of native vegetation for fire mitigation purposes. Now, again, look at, Hornsby, where you've got all these houses, they were built obviously 50 years ago, where there's really the bush needs to be absolutely cleared back from around them, and that's never going to happen, unfortunately. Well, the only way it's going to happen is if there's a massive bloody fire like at Turramurra, and the fire actually clears it out. But essentially, just ban development, ban building, and I could just go on and on and on, but we'd be here all day. So it is interesting, going and bothering to have a read through the stuff, and then looking back at the statements. I'm probably going to do another video on this kind of stuff. Is there actually any truth that I can see in the assertion that resources to the RFS are being cut? And look, having had a read through these reports so far, I can see that last year there were some one-off expenses for things like the Army gave the RFS a couple of Black Hawk helicopters, and there was a boost in funding, one-off boost in funding provided to make those helicopters operational for fire suppression. Obviously you've got to invest in getting free helicopters, but where are you going to park them? How are you going to maintain them? How are you going to fuel them? You've got to train pilots, blah, blah, blah. There's a cost for that. There was also a one-off cost I could see for redevelopment of lots of fire stations, or what do they call them? But that's actually in one of these reports somewhere. They have some lovely tables in here. Review of operations. There's all sorts of stuff you can read about. Where the money got spent, etc. And it clearly lists these things. Another one was, again, a one-off expenditure to, I think, improve the radio communication thing. Well, you don't need to spend that money every year. You do this one-off upgrade and that's it. There's also like a one-off investment, I think, in some more aircraft. It's if there were cuts to things like where have I got it here somewhere? Right, operating expenses. If there were clear cuts to things like employee-related expenses and other expenses, then I would say, yeah, there's been a cut. If I went and had a look at the vehicle fleet numbers and saw there'd been this huge reduction in the number of vehicles and trailers being operated, then you go, yeah, there's been a cut. But I can't actually see any of that in here. So I guess someone's put out a press release, and this councillor feels that she has to repeat the press release without actually delving into the facts. Anyway, I think I've ranted enough.